The instant that the news emerged about the final settlement agreement between the SEC and Ripple, a wave of shock swept through the community. Even though the deal was described publicly as a clean resolution, it was referred to in hushed tones privately as something that was far more complicated, far more strategic, and far more impactful on the future of XRP. Insiders and legal experts began to observe a troubling trend in Ripple's conduct following the settlement, despite the fact that the media was celebrating the conclusion of the court battle that had been going on for 10 years. These patterns were just little, but they were significant hints that something more profound, something concealed, had been traded behind closed doors. The Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) did not leave the situation empty-handed, and Ripple did not come out of it without suffering consequences, according to the new theory that is currently being discussed among legal professionals. Instead, there is a possibility that a confidential settlement deal has a covert phrase that is buried deep inside the document. If this is the case, the SEC would have been able to declare victory without having to admit to defeat, the authority to compel Ripple to decrease its supply of goods. The narrative that was intended for the general audience was constructed in a tidy manner. Ripple has paid a fine, the lawsuit has been closed, and institutions can finally feel safe entering. The actual narrative lies underneath that polished exterior. It is the Securities and Exchange Commission's final strategic move, a final gamble to safeguard the larger financial system from what they were concerned may become a catastrophe marked by volatility as soon as complete institutional adoption takes place. Ripple's ability to exert control over the market through its escrow holdings was due to the structure of XRP, according to the SEC's argument for a number of years. The SEC claimed that Ripple had considerable influence over price dynamics as a result of the locked supply. Transparency reports, automated releases, and contractual limitations were among the countermeasures employed by Ripple. On the other hand, after the dust settled, the SEC miraculously yielded without forcing all of its customary demands. For what reason? This is due to the fact that, as this hypothetical tale implies, they had obtained something that was significantly more potent, a forced escrow burn that is not implemented immediately, but rather triggered slowly over the course of a multi-year compliance timetable and incorporated into the settlement structure. As far as the SEC was concerned, this was the most ideal resolution. They could preserve their dignity by stating that the settlement had destroyed Ripple's control, while simultaneously making sure that the circulating supply of XRP would decrease to levels that would safeguard investors in the retail sector from dilution, and simultaneously preparing the asset to be used on a scale that is efficient for institutional liquidity. The unfolding of the suspenseful story involving money starts right here. The XRP's growth, which was once regarded as a stabilizing influence, unexpectedly becomes the most important negotiating chip in a legal game of chess. Ripple was in dire need of clarity. The banks, liquidity providers, and international institutions were sitting on the sidelines, waiting for a decision that would allow them to expand the XRP ledger without fear of being subject to regulatory scrutiny. The Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) was in dire need of a symbolic victory since they were humiliated by their incoherent arguments and unsuccessful endeavors to extend securities law through litigation. As a result, a compromise was reached. There will be no categorization, no prohibition, and no appeal. However, the escrow is something that has to be eliminated, not all at once, not in front of. In the context of this hypothetical situation, the reasoning behind the Securities and Exchange Commission is unexpectedly pragmatic. They are aware that XRP was designed with the intention of being used for settlement on a worldwide scale, which is in contrast to previous cryptocurrencies. If central banks, large banks, quarters, and platforms for tokenized assets start routing trillions of dollars via XRP, it is imperative that an enormous decrease in supply be implemented. Without this, the market may have difficulties in liquidity, sharp spikes in volatility, and the possibility of a retail panic as whales acquire holdings. In this case, the SEC carried out the most effective regulatory actions possible. They developed a pressure valve, destroyed the escrow, cut down on supply, increased liquidity, and, most crucially, safeguarded the future system against expansion that is not regulated. In the face of having to make the decision between burning escrow or continuing to be subject to unending regulatory ambiguity, Ripple decided to agree. At that point, the mathematical consequences that are brought to light are just astounding. The escrow, which constitutes around half of the supply, has historically been viewed as a check on inflation, but it has suddenly become the foundation of the most aggressive supply shock in the history of digital assets. XRP becomes the first significant asset in which supply destruction is not elective, not political, not community-driven, but legally compelled as the fires escalate. This gets us to the following phase of the narrative, which is the narrative's transformation into a legal necessity for the price. XRP's available supply will collapse if it does not have an escrow. If there is no escrow, the amount of liquidity that is circulating will be insufficient. The newly constructed financial railroads that are asked on XRP's settlement layer would confront an existential pressure to adjust the asset's price upward in the absence of escrow. The quantity of tokens is not of concern to banks. What matters to them is the worth of each individual unit. Throughput is what matters to liquidity corridors. They do not concern themselves with retail charts. In order for XRP to manage trillion-dollar flows with a dramatically lesser supply, the only mathematical solution is for the price per token to be significantly higher. This is the point at which the contentious $25,000 aim becomes part of the fictional narrative as a tool of system maintenance rather than as a speculative endeavor. The equilibrium price will increase at an exponential rate when you simultaneously decrease the supply by more than half and increase the institutional flow by more than a factor of 10. Price becomes infrastructure while value is transformed into usefulness. XRP, which was formerly used to operate remittances, has now become the global liquidity oil for tokenized commodities. Agreements reached by businesses, treasury flows, interbank foreign exchange swaps, and the interoperability of central bank digital currencies, XRPL corridors are now requiring XRP to be purchased at institutional settlement valuations rather than at retail pricing as of this writing. A $10 or $50 XRP is not sufficient to move trillion-dollar daily movements. However, when you consider that XRP is worth $1,000, it starts to approach the level of enterprise utility. When you examine an XRP that ranges in value from $10,000 to $25,000, it becomes a settlement layer that is required on a mathematical basis. It is not due to the height, but rather because of the limitations imposed by the design. According to this story, the concealed settlement clause comes into play at the point in time when XRP undergoes a transformation from being a volatile retail asset to being a systemic institutional utility. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which has long been ridiculed for its failure to understand cryptocurrencies, Ripple is under pressure to reach burn milestones even though this is not being done in public. If their demands are not fulfilled, the provisions of the settlement may be violated. Supply shock will occur more quickly as a result of interacting with them. As a result of each burn cycle, analysts are required to reassess fair value, and the resulting numbers expand exponentially. In contrast to the perspective of retail investors who perceive burns as positive developments, institutions regard them as essential modifications that are required in order to make the most of increased rates of capital flow. In the meantime, the SEC is observing from the shadows with the knowledge that the victory they achieved through the forced destruction of the escrow is an unusual one that was attained indirectly. They will have the capacity to claim that they corrected XRP's structure while also enabling it to become the first global settlement asset that is completely compliant. It suddenly becomes clear that the legal chess match makes perfect sense. Ripple is granted regulatory clarification. As a result of this, banks are able to achieve settlement stability. The SEC achieves victory in the realm of narrative redemption. XRP, which has finally been released from the burden of the escrow, is now commencing its transformation into an institutional settlement layer that is extremely rare and extremely efficient. It is now mathematically necessary to attain valuations that were earlier regarded to be out of the question. As the process of burning assets continues, liquidity is decreasing, and the global financial system is transitioning toward flows that are tokenized. The supply of XRP is decreasing even as its role is increasing. An inexpensive XRP is something that the system can no longer bear to have. The passageways would be damaged as a result of this. It would put a damper on liquidity on a global scale. Trillions of dollars worth of settlement would be affected by it. When a price point reaches a certain level, it does not become speculation. Rather, it becomes a structural requirement. And so, within the